Palm Sunday gives way to Holy Week, a time when we invest ourselves in the examination of a great number of events that lead to Jesus' crucifixion. Indeed, if you were to begin at the beginning of any of the Gospels and read from the beginning clear to the end, you would notice that in each of them, the entire way they are on their way to Jerusalem. It is as if Jesus' whole life leads up to his triumphant entry, eventual judgment, and crucifixion in Jerusalem. If you read through any of the Gospels, they make it clear that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem the entire time. And so this week, as we read the lessons carefully and invest ourselves in the Scriptures and complete this holy and sacred season of Lent, we see these events unfold in a way that might open our hearts anew to what is happening in each moment of this week. A few of you noted on our way in that I'm wearing a garment that you have not seen. Someone said, you've got a new robe. In fact, I have a very old robe. The robe, the chasuble that I am wearing was a gift from a dear friend and a mentor who really became much more than that. His name is David McCallum. He was an Episcopal priest, and he really became, for me, an adopted grandfather. He was one that spent a great deal at our home, many family dinners shared, as he was serving as a long-term supply priest to a church near our home church. Now, David's story is unique. David grew up the son of British parents in New York. And he would come home from school each day, and his mother would ask him to relay or recall the day's events to her, and then she would correct his speech to preserve a certain integrity to the English language. He'd say things like privacy. Privacy just sounds so much better, doesn't it? So when you were out with him, sometimes people would mistake him as being British when he'd never actually lived there. Now, David, from a very early age, felt the call of God to the priesthood. Maybe even unusually so. He knew from an early age that he was to devote his life to the church, to the proclamation of the gospel, to the serving of God's people, to the serving of the sacraments of God. But before he could make it to seminary, he was drafted and served in World War II, where he would fall asleep marching to the Battle of the Bulge, narrowly escaping minefields, and suffered some shrapnel that left him with a bit of a hunch for his entire life. He returned back to the States and did go to seminary, where at the ripe old age of 28, he was the old man. This is different times. Now the average age of an Episcopal seminarian is somewhere in the 40s. But at the time, everybody went straight from college. So he served not only while he was learning, but he served the younger men there as a bit of a role model, having returned from the war. Now, God saw all these great qualities in David that would make him a great leader and raised him to the life and ministry in the priesthood and serving the church. And he quickly found his way to being a leader in the church and was very proud to have served as the rector of what he affectionately referred to as Mad Mary's on the Hill in Kansas City. Apparently, St. Mary's in Kansas was a cardinal parish of the diocese, and he was quite proud to have been the rector there at Mad Mary's. It was when he was serving as rector at Mad Mary's in his 40s that he was at a doctor's visit and was, I'm uncertain of the exact nature of the diagnosis, but they told him that if he had something that he wanted to do, he better get busy doing it, because they didn't expect him to make it more than 3 or 4 more years. He would have an illness that would cause an early death. And David once again took this call as a call to action and serve God in new and more profound ways. Quickly, he did a bit of research about where he might go and serve as a missionary, where his life might be in danger, but he figured he didn't have long to live anyway, and so he thought he would invest himself in a way that would serve and proclaim the gospel in a way that others might not be able to. And so he was quickly enrolled in a Spanish immersion program, submitting his resignation to Mad Mary's, and found his way to Nicaragua, where, much to the doctor's surprise, he served for the next 12 years. Providing sacraments, leadership, establishing a seminary that would train Nicaraguans to be priests to the people of Nicaragua, traveling principally by dugout mahogany canoe, getting his connection to the outside world through the BBC, his mother would have been proud, through the BBC on a shortwave radio. And he was fond of saying, "I'd still be there if it hadn't been for the Nicaraguan Revolution." Indeed, later I would learn from other clergy, the bishop of the diocese where we live had helped secure his plane ride out of Nicaragua, and it sounds as though it may have been the last seat on the last plane to safety. He escaped with a few treasures, including this chasuble. He continued to serve, again, much to the doctor's surprise. The doctor had long died, I think. Because he returned from Nicaragua in the early 80s, right? So he continued to serve first as the rector of a small church in a neighboring town to us where we first got to know him, and then continued to serve in the diocesan office, and eventually would retire to Tomo, where I grew up, near the family, because we were already, we'd adopted him at that point. But it's interesting to me on this Palm Sunday in particular to examine the life of a man who was so devoted. I don't know too many people who lived as perfectly within the gospel as David, with such a servant's heart, with such dedication to the proclamation of the gospel and the serving of God's people and the calling to others to join God's people. There's not many people like David McCallum. He died this week, 2008. But he still lives on in my heart, and he's still remembered by many. But to look at such a man who had such dedication and fervor for the gospel, and wonder why his life was still marked with such suffering. A hunch from shrapnel. A bad diagnosis, which obviously wasn't quite as bad as the doctor had made it out to be, but still clearly medical issues throughout his life. He contracted malaria while he was in Nicaragua, which continued to plague him till his final years with ice-cold hands and all kinds of problems. And we see that even as we follow Christ, there's still pain and sadness and suffering. To me, this is part of this passion narrative that we read each Palm Sunday, is that even in the perfection of the life of Christ as he leads us towards God, we still see pain and suffering and sadness and sorrow. I think sometimes our culture would have us confuse these things and say that when you are suffering, when you are sad, when you've been subjected to something, it's because of something you did, and it's simply not true. Because even in perfection, there is struggle. And I suspect each of us can relay smaller stories from our own lives where we struggle to follow Jesus on a daily basis, where we fail to make the choice that is better, where we are tempted to take what is easy or feels good rather than what we know to be wholly good and true in the light of the gospel. And my hope, my prayer for us is that Palm Sunday might mark the beginning of a very holy week and a time where we complete the sense of self-examination that we have invested ourselves in during this holy and sacred season of Lent. But I hope that it also serves as a reminder that pain, suffering, and sadness are simply part of our human existence and not the punishment of God. May we learn from Christ as He's nailed to the cross and still saving the sinners to His left and to His right. Amen.